thank you so much for attending, and this is going to be a wonderful session. And so I'll hand it over. Please ahead and please take over.
All right, so let's give a quick background. So thank you, Jamie, for inviting us. So a little bit about, Jordon and I. One of the things we do, so we've worked on a lot of different places with organizations, and usually the organizations are interested in leadership and the use of knowledge and learning and the ability to adapt in a really fast-changing environment. But we also teach at Columbia University, and we designed for Columbia a course that I think was the last face-to-face course that we did, which was in January in New York at Columbia on the future of work. So what we thought we would do is talk to you about what did we learn about the future of work. And obviously a lot of it has to do with implications for knowledge and for learning and for development. So I'm going to turn it over to Jordon to pull up the slides and to get started. And, we'll introduce ourselves. My background was largely at NASA, retired as the Chief Knowledge Officer after a large number of years. I got involved in the project work after the space shuttle tragedy, where NASA wanted to set up a learning academy. And Jordon's got his expertise starting off in the naval submarine program. So why don't I turn it over to you, Jordon, to talk about yourself and get us started.
Is that showing up okay for you guys, Jamie, on your end? Just making sure. All right.
Good.
That's Ed and that's our three best friends on the screen there. We keep a tight social network. But no, like Ed said, Jordon Sims, my background, Annapolis grad here at Naval Academy, submarine officer for a little over 10 years, and went out in the private sector and have a background across policy area, Capitol Hill, Pentagon, and all that on my public sector service side, Department of Energy, et cetera, and have a public affairs firm now that we do a lot of global work and helping business and government connect in the middle and get things done a little bit better, navigating regulatory requirements and policies and helping government better understand technologies and things of that nature. And aside from the government policy side, we do a lot around products and service development and things like that. And it's fun, a little bit of everything. And like Ed said, Columbia is, the Ivy League system's been a little bit lost and floating in the wind, and they had to pull in a Naval Academy guy to nail down this future of work thing. So happy to help Ed any way I can.
I realize.
But no, it's a great program. Lost, as Ed said, we lost a little bit of momentum on it, but I think what we've got here is a lot of people ask us, a question we often get is, how's the future of work that you guys have been researching, looking at, and changing? How's that been impacted by this current environment? And largely, to be perfectly honest with you, I wish we would have called our shot sooner. It hasn't changed much. There's been a bit of a catalyst. Some stuff has accelerated, and we'll go through some of that here and cover that as to how some of it's remained relatively consistent as well too. All right.
So one of the things, so everybody who presents, right, has a bias. I always tell my students, I always told my NASA folks that, just understand where I'm coming from, because then we can disagree and get better. Jordon and I kind of, we align up about one probably, key premise, and that is that above all else, what's important for the success of organizations, teams, is people working effectively together. So as we look at the issue of the future of work, what stands out is the incredible technologies, the robots that are out there, the new ways of doing business, the sharing of different capabilities. That has all been game changers. And what we've seen in the organizations that we've worked with, we've both consulted organizations. We worked together at the Project Management Institute with a council of 90 organizations, Amazon, NASA, Microsoft, John Deere, all these different firms. And what really still comes down to success is the robots, the tools, the technology is not yet at the point where when it comes down to innovation, creativity, learning, understanding empathy, the ability to work with what people and customers want, how to do that right. So it's really that mixture of the technology and the tools, the critical thinking, the innovation that humans bring to the equation. And this is a quote that Hess discussed in his book, that we both kind of link it. And probably what we're always saying to organizations, to leaders, to students is, you gotta match the value and the collaboration and the learning and the knowledge from people and hear that voice as the technology and the data helps you be successful. So they're both together. So that's kind of our bias, that's our perspective, and that's probably what you're gonna hear as we move forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And the one thing that concerns us, again, kind of going back to that compare and contrast of what we've been seeing on the future of work is, the technology piece of this, pre-COVID and this whole pandemic situation, we often reminded folks, don't get distracted by the tools and the tech. Every organization seems to chase its tail on trying to keep up with the tech. First of all, if you're able to keep up with it, the tech companies would be out of business. It's their job to stay ahead of you. The second part of that is it tends to diminish the focus on the people aspect. And we could all implement the same cutting edge machine learning, AI, automation, robotic process, whatever it is. It simply raises the baseline of the productivity. The competitive advantage for any organization, public or private sector, is going to be the people behind it. It is something now, fast forward to today, that concerns us in that, where did we start this conversation before the presentation? What tools and tech are you using? What things are you utilizing now that you didn't use before? So there is a bit of a catalyst to drive that focus away from the people, which are often can be out of sight and out of mind with everybody working individually and remotely. So from a knowledge, learning, and leadership standpoint, how do we bring those folks into the fold, or strategies that we work with organizations on helping to develop in this environment? Real quick, Ed, I'll kick it over to you here, but these are just some, references. We've got a couple of activities that Ed will describe for you. Jamie, I think we have a small enough group. We probably don't need to do breakouts. We'll just keep everybody together and just kind of do it more as an individual thing as we get to them. Don't worry, they're fun. They're not awkward. At least Ed and I don't think they're awkward, which is probably a warped baseline, Ed.
Which means that they're probably awkward. Yeah, you got a space guy and a submarine guy.
Yeah, but extreme domains of isolation and space and undersea. But the thing that we have here is just some things to think about as you go through those activities as kind of a reference point, right? Challenge yourself to compare and contrast them, right? Challenge your preconceived notions. What was I thinking about, why I was part of this community, why I'm here, what I'm hoping to get out of it? What would that answer have been a year ago versus today, right, in those environments? What are some of your greatest concerns about how work gets done in your organization? What are some of the hopes for the future of work in your organization? How do you hope it changes and shifts? And we'll cover some of that, including some of the counterintuitive trends when we get to it that people aren't realizing as positives in this environment. And what's your view on leadership a year ago versus today versus what you'll hope it'll be, considering the fact that there is obviously going to be a shift in the way these organizations work?
Yeah, and the other thing I'd say here is we won't get into discussion here. We have two activities that we'll get you involved with as we go through this. One is what are the key strengths that you bring, superhero strengths for the future of work. That's one of the things we do with our students and organizations. And then I see John Lewis is here. One of the things I'm a big believer in is the importance of story. I think the best leaders, project managers, systems engineers, they have the ability to use and to tell stories, and organizations learn that way. And so for both Jordan and I, when we work with organizations and students, the starting point is to get into a conversation. Because I think the natural tendency is that people want to get the answer. Right? We're here to listen, you guys should have the answer. Well, we don't have the answers. We have a perspective. And so part of the question with any kind of an organization, sponsor, leader is, why are we here? What are you trying to do? What are you trying to change? What are the things you're worried about? That was my starting point at NASA. I was an organizational psychologist and OD guy going back to 1983. I started as an intern. And I'm asked to develop a leadership framework for folks who went to the moon. That was the Apollo generation. And the only thing I could rely on was just having a conversation with these folks. And then they said what their concerns were, what their vision for the future was. And then we started the discussion in terms of what they saw and what they wanted for leadership. So the message here is that these are questions that I think are important to get into a conversation with any client, organization, or with students. So if we go to the next slide, one of the things here is, what does work look like? And there isn't a future. There isn't a future. There's a future, but it's now. It's all been happening. So we did this class in January. One of the nice things that I heard, I'm teaching the students again, a course on building knowledge strategy. It's really consulting skills meets knowledge meets projects of how do you do these things. And one of the things that the students who had taken our course said was that it was really fortunate to have taken the Future of Work course in January, because it kind of got their head ready for what they've been dealing with in terms of the importance of virtuality, in terms of the importance of people, in terms of the importance about the constant learning, adapting new ways. So I want to talk a little bit about the future of work. Stiglitz has written a lot, world-class economist. He's teaches at Columbia. And I think the major point here is that work has changed dramatically, and particularly in the last decade, so that the value and the ultimate winning is usually about the ideas that people, that teams, that organizations have. So the things that are making money nowadays, if we want to look at it at that standpoint, are things that are weightless, but they're ideas, they're concepts, they're the exchange of knowledge. And it's different than the economists from years ago, which the focus was still on the tangibles of labor, of having capital, of having people. Nowadays, you can be an Alibaba, you can have a fraction of the workforce that a Ford has and make much more money because they're selling concepts and ideas. So that to me is the driver. And of course, with this group, this makes sense. But when we talk to organizations and to folks, it's a different kind of a framework. It also means that there's constant change. We have a friend, Ben Royce, who is at Google, and he is the lead for global data science. He's a student from our program a few years back. Incredibly bright guy. He's probably around 30 or so. And I asked him one day, I said, how do you deal with the constant change at Google? How do you, it's mind-boggling sometimes to me, just the upgrades on computers. And he said, we don't think about it. He says, I don't think my generation thinks about change as a time frame. We just expect it's always going to happen. You show up in the office, you expect that something's different. By the time the day ends, probably you're doing something. Certainly during the week, things are constantly changing. So the nature of work and life has changed, where change is perpetual. When I got to NASA, which was again in the early 80s, if you asked leaders about how much change they anticipated, 90% of them would say they didn't expect any change for many years. And you'd get maybe 10% who thought there'd be a little bit of change. How totally different world is.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a dirty word on that screen. I apologize for that, everybody. The word transformation. It drives me nuts. I think we'll probably all have transformation exhaustion and fatigue from the amount of times we've heard that word, whether it's digital transformations, agile transformations, whatever the situation is. But Ed brings up a good point. Google's, the Amazons, there's a number of organizations that we've worked with, and we've juxtaposed a few of them against each other just to help highlight that compare and contrast piece a bit. Some of those organizations are born into it. Yesterday doesn't look like today. Today doesn't look like tomorrow. That's their normal, right? But how do you compare that to a Boeing, right? A military, aerospace manufacturing, 150-year legacy of success that's been built on doing things a certain way, right? That is a very simple concept for them to grasp, not easy to act on, right? So it's something I think to think about as well too when we talk about ideas being the value driver of this new economy and the way things are working, how those ideas flow, how quickly they can flow, and how quickly you can make a decision on them, or what actually drives the dirty word transformation of your organization. But if you're perpetually in that mindset, you don't have to transform anything. You simply just go with the flow, right? And that's what we're seeing
It
today.
skills is this whole the ability to manage and change, and we can go in a whole direction on that.
Oh, yeah,
We go to the yeah.
That's a three-day effort. Yeah. Go ahead, Ed.
So this is again, I mean, what's going on now? I don't think there's anything here that will be surprising. It's based on work of Thomas Koken from MIT, from Stefan Kasriel, who is the former CEO of Upwork, who's part of the World Economic Forum, the work around the World Economic Forum. But I use that particularly for organizations to say, what are the areas that you need to be starting to get good at? And I use it for leaders and for students to say, which aspect of this are you really good at so you can make a living, you can sell, you can do things you want to do, and what aspects of this are areas that you really need to work on. So briefly, maybe I'll take a couple, and then Jordan,
Go ahead, Ed.
you hit on some of those. But you know, if you go to my LinkedIn, a couple of years ago, I was at an event. There was a LinkedIn woman who is saying, you know, you have a nice profile here, but you're using it wrong. I said, well, what do you mean I'm using it wrong? She says, you're supposed to have a very short description of who you are, you know, like a sentence or a few words. I said, you know, I've been at NASA 33 years. I've been working I mean, how do I get that down into 3 words? And she asked a great question. She said, what do you think is most important? I said, that's easy. People, people, people. So if you go to my LinkedIn site, that's what's there. And so the first one there, inclusion and appreciation, I always start with. To me, the best teams, we found this at NASA. We did a lot of work in terms of project teams. There's work by Charlie Pellerin on how NASA builds teams. And the starting point is the human side, the people side. And the starting point is, do people appreciate the project, the mission that they're working on? Do they appreciate each other? And inclusion from the standpoint, not agreement. The best teams I've seen often argued, they yelled, they shouted, they fought with each other, but they all had a voice so they could be heard. And I think one of the biggest challenge for organizations and teams is that they don't focus enough on how to work together, the human issue, the importance of growth, learning, appreciation, inclusion, the use of story, hearing each other, because they assume those things will happen. And my sense is about 20 to 30% of firms really take that seriously. Most use lip service, and they start on the mission side. So I would start with the inclusion and appreciation is about how do we take care of our people, and you know, everything is done in terms of teams. Jordan?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Ed. And I think 2 of them that I'll call attention to, and we'll dive, I mean, all these are relevant, given the time we have, we'll dive deeper into a couple of them. The autonomy and purpose piece, right? Some of that's a bit modified. Ed mentioned Stefan Kasriel, former CEO of Upwork. We had him guest lecture with the cohort that we ran in January, specifically around this. But it's a little bit bigger than just freelancing and the use of gig economy, you know, participants and gig workers. It's around how do you actually drive self-organizing teams and organizations? How do you drive alignment with them? And the purpose piece is going to be the new valuation of organizations, especially those in the private sector. And we'll cover that in a little bit more detail as well too. But Larry Fink from BlackRock sends a letter every year to the CEOs as kind of a responsible fiduciary of his investors' money that he's taking care of, to let them know that, you know, hey, the dynamic is shifting. We're not going to be grading you on the tangibles anymore. The intangibles are what matters, and we'll cover that in a little bit, which aligns to what NASA and what Ed's referring to, the mission piece. But what's the overall purpose, what we're trying to do? Rise of automation and AI. I know it's top of mind. It's probably my second most fatigued phrase behind transformation, right? The machines are not going to take over the world. I remind people that all the time. If we had more time, I'd show you an endless montage of Roombas that are stuck behind doorways and banging into stairs. I love it when my Siri on my phone says, I can't help you right now, I'm basically busy. It reassures me that all of that stuff is completely flawed and nobody's coming to take over the world. So rest assured, we can, you know, kick that can down the road and cover that in a future talk. But the organizational identity piece, right? This encompasses everything that extends from that purpose. what does the social responsibility of the organization look like? What does the corporate citizenship look like? How do you incorporate the purpose into the work that they're doing? What is some of those issues, and how does that get mapped into the overall strategy of the organization, and how the organization extends its identity, its values, its principles, how teams pursue those values as a means of driving those team-based outcomes. Those are all key factors that have changed the way organizations are working today into the future than say 3 to 5 years ago in terms of where that focus was. It used to be a focus on education, the fruit salad after the last name, in terms of certifications, credentials, top tier MBAs for the top, for the big 4 consulting firms and whatever else it might be. Now we're starting to look at driving a diversity of how people, not so much from a traditional diversity standpoint, but a diverse way of pursuing those values and principles of the organization that create that constructive tension around the ideas. And we'll cover that in a little bit as well, too.
So we got a question about defining organizational identity and the social responsibility. We'll get into that, but one of the things I would say is that organizations, I think for the first time in history, now all have to be concerned with their reputations from the standpoint of, are they trustworthy? Yeah. So you look at Google. Google's, I guess, one of the big 5. They're probably close to $1 trillion in earnings. They're doing a lot of good things. They're doing a lot of development. But when they develop the ability to track using data to deal with the coronavirus, there's also a large part of the public said, no, I don't trust you. I don't think you're there to help us. I think you're there to hurt us. They had an issue where they had employees who didn't want to work because they had a contract, a year ago with the military for using data for different kinds of things. And they were concerned about that. And all of these teams and organizations, or NASA has an issue when they launch. It's, what are you launching? And there are many things going on. So this notion of organizational identity is the term we're using to kind of cover this area of how are they seen from a social responsibility standpoint? How are they seen as how they work with their communities? How are they seen from the standpoint of, are they adding to society and to people, or are they detracting from it?
And how do they convey trust to their products and
services? Didn't have to care about. Nowadays they do.
Yep.
Sorry.
Yep. And how they convey trust to their products and service. Mark Benioff from Salesforce is another example. Their mission is to convey trust through their products and services based on what those values and principles in the organization are. They make those known, they're transparent about them, and how they pursue them. You can end up with a lot of people that think the same, act the same, do the same, right? But if they're not diversely pursuing those principles, you may get somewhere really fast. You may just not like where you get, right? So how do you drive a little bit of constructive tension and how those principles and values are pursued is one of the key competitive advantages that organizations are doing well to convey that trust. Real quick, like I mentioned, the Larry Fink piece, this is from his 2018 letter to investors. He did the same thing in 2019. 2020, he shot off on a tangent in a different direction, primarily around climate change. But he is very heavily focusing on a new way of valuation. One of the key facts behind this is the purpose of an organization is going to become a way upon which organizations are valued from a book value standpoint. Sounds great. Everybody raises an eyebrow. Show me how that's going to work. The numbers are there. Ed and I were just talking about this. Roughly 35% of the workforce today are millennials, right? In some way, shape, or form of generation X, Y, Z. I lose track of them all. I'm not sure where I fall. I think I'm the forgotten generation that didn't even get a category, to be honest with you. I think Jamie Reed and I are right around that same neck of the woods. But the fact of the matter is there's going to be the largest transfer of wealth, $24 trillion, between the baby boomers and that millennial generation when this happens, right? And that mindset's completely different when you think about that, right?
I'm always paying you, Jordan. I'm always paying
Ed, and let the record show, Ed has not transferred any wealth to date, right? So this is recorded for posterity, Ed, you're behind the curve. But it is true, right? And those mindsets are different. What drives that workforce is very much purpose driven. So it's only going to change that organizational identity, going back to that connection of how they view things and what they look at. The book values there, this is from Bloomberg itself. You can see the natural trend over time. on the book value per share and versus the tangible book value. So you're seeing the rise of intangibles driving the valuation of the organizations over time. It's a pretty powerful graphic when you kind of think about it and put that into perspective. It's not the fleet of vehicles, it's not the product on the shelf, it's not the real estate assets that are driving these bottom line valuations. It's the ideas, how those ideas flow, how Apple turns those into patents, how they not only create an iPod and a music player, but how do they put 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 ideas around that, right? From a platform strategy standpoint, and revamp and disrupt an entire music industry, right? So those are some of the ways that organizations are driving value and how they're going to be valued going forward, which really requires, I think, leaders to change the way they think. And it's challenging, right? Because 85% of the S&P 500 right now, roughly, is based on intangibles from a value standpoint. That means your leaders, your CFOs of organizations may be making business decisions based on 15% of what they see of an organization's value today.
This is also, to me, this is dramatic because I grew up, again, my background, got my learning at Columbia in organization development, you know, in the time coming after the work of Bennis and Sean and all those folks. And then they gave me a project management academy to develop. And so I've been spending my whole life saying learning is important, innovation is important, knowledge is important. How do you sell that to organizations? And but again, I mean, with the data, what the economists are saying, the economists are all about how wealth is created. They're saying it's in these areas that are the differentiators. It's in the areas of how fast you can learn, how you can tap into knowledge and expertise, how you can innovate. But these are very tough for, I would say, most organizations or managers because they are intangible in nature. And my experience is most managers, if they can't touch it, measure it, you know, feel it, then they're really skeptical about it.
Yep. And so just to build on that, just a couple, you know, examples here: capitalism without capital, you know, the rise of the intangible economy. A number of folks have started picking up on the concept. I'd like to say we led it, Ed, but we have a number of things we're researching and building some models on to help organizations provide some of that context around how to measure them. And that's something we work with a lot of organizations on going forward. Anybody know who this is out of curiosity? Besides Ed? No?
Jamie could know this guy.
Hard to do on a Zoom call, right? This is Paul Romer, 2018 Nobel Prize winner for economics. Quote from him: "Growth springs from better recipes, not just more cooking." So again, just another reinforcing point of the fact that most organizations typically look outside their organization for growth, outside capital, mergers and acquisitions, all the things that they do for that outside growth catalyst. And Paul developed the endogenous growth theory that he won the Nobel Prize for, that it actually comes from inside the organization, from how we improve the recipes, how do we drive the learning, the ideas, and how do we implement and execute on those more effectively and efficiently. Anything you want to add on this one, Ed?
No, I mean, I think it's interesting. The story background of these things are something, because I guess he started doing this research on these notions about 30 years ago, and never went anywhere at the time. It was very controversial and kind of ignored, and he got his Nobel Prize 30 years after it. So to me, I also see that as one of the things is how dramatic and different the world is, and just recognizing that.
Yeah. Does that mean we can start our clock, Ed, 30 years?
Unfortunately. Yeah. You know, we were talking about organizational identity. Again, this is the thing. So the United Nations has their Sustainable Development Goals, their SDGs, and they're basically the key issues that are expected to be worked, you know, by, or you know, being impacted by 2030, and measured and approved, and their projects and activities around all these things. This is the social dimension. This is something that capitalists and organizations didn't really have to think about. Many probably don't think about them now, but they get into the future of work from the standpoint of what's being done around climate, being done around issues around gender, what's being done about privacy. We're in a world of technology and data. And this is a whole new area of focus and frankly, a whole new area of work. Many of the students that we teach, one of the issues that are important to them is that they're working for a firm that is contributing to society. And so it's again, it's a dramatic shift over and has a lot of implications for the work that we all do. And why don't we go to the next slide?
Yeah, go ahead.
And
These are some, these are some key considerations to think about. We talked about, kind of those frame reference questions at the beginning, kind of 1 year ago versus today, and some of those issues. Just how some of the fundamentals of work are reshaping in the current environment, right? Obviously, the remote versus on-site is the elephant in the room. Everybody's seeing that shift in their organization, whether they're in the public or private sector. There's a number of challenges that come with that. But I can tell you right now, we work with a number of that represent leading Silicon Valley technology clients, specifically in the technology and the cyberspace areas. They are openly admitting that they are more productive today than they were 3 to 5 months ago before this all started. And I've been hearing that from more folks. They feel like they're getting more work done. They're getting more focus time. You don't have the fishbowl effect of everybody dropping by the office and distracting you and pulling you out for the lunch break and whatever else it is. It's also a little bit of a risk, right, in the sense that we're having a hard time drawing boundaries. There's, mental health issues, just stress issues. Blood pressure is probably up. There's not a clear way and line of demarcation to get away from the work and shift gears to being the mom or being the dad or whatever it is you need to do at home, and other factors. Flexibility versus security, right? Ed and I are loving this, right? I mean, we're able to do what we need to do, much more flexibility with our organizations and clients. I'm working with, congressional committees and everybody else, not worrying about traffic in DC. Parking isn't an issue. I'm getting better workouts in. It's fantastic, right? But there's a trade-off. There's a yin and a yang to this, the security piece, the gig workers, the Uber drivers, everybody else that's fallen prey to the situation. There's a flexibility versus security balance that leaders have to take into account and really understand the dynamics of those on their teams as to which ones really benefit them and how do they help them strike that balance. We touched on trust. This is a return to work ratio issue, right? For folks that are in-person activity heavy in those industries, manufacturing, sporting, we talked about, kind of informally, how those industries are going to work, tourism and travel, things that require you to show up in person, whether you're a worker or consumer, are going to be really heavily driven on trust. Ed and I would have said before this, that was our main metric for collaboration in organization. How do you measure that intangible in organization? We mapped out trust and collaboration in that area. Trust is driving this now. So we have technology organizations that are driving apps and dashboards that help leaders visualize and take data analysis on what people's sentiments are in terms of their confidence in returning to work. Remote work is humanizing work right now, right? People are a lot more tolerant of the distractions. I'll use Jamie as an example. Jamie is, an employee of ours, for example, right? The expectations on Jamie to have that clear line between personal and professional and always be showing up in the 9 to 5 and being on point, right? That's a lot more relaxed now. The dog's barking in the background. The kids are hungry. I just saw a viral video that went on today, a 7-year-old, I don't know if you've seen it, right? Her poor mother came out of the shower to get dressed, and the kid's doing school right there in her bedroom, and the mother had to laugh and say, we're all not perfect. I just flashed my entire 7-year-old's grade school class as I walked across the room, right? That's going to happen, right? So we're seeing more humanizing work, and that's driving a lot of value around the intangibles, right? What does the learning look like in the organization? How does the knowledge flow and the culture piece? The last thing is, I think what's interesting, there's a number of different counterintuitive perspectives on this, and some of them in some very controversial areas, some not so controversial. Skills versus roles has often been a debate in organizations. Where do we focus? Do we focus on developing the role? Do we focus on developing the skill? That's very much coming into play now, and I think the dynamic's shifted. The skills are what matters versus the actual role. We really don't care what it is you do or what your email signature says it is you do. These are the skills we need, and these are the things we need to get done, because we're basically turning our business model on its head to stay afloat or stay alive today, right? Or the way the government is delivering services or whatever it might be, that's really changing. And I think people are playing utility player catch-all in those areas. for leaders, how you develop performance metrics. We talked about this a little bit earlier and touched on it. How you evaluate your teams and their connection to the work that's being done is going to have to completely change. People are out of sight, out of mind, more individual contributors in some of these roles. And how do you adjust and adapt those are things that leaders need to think about. And we work through that. A great case example, I won't go into the whole thing now, is Patty McCord, who established the culture at Netflix. There's a number of great publications on her. We lead a lot of workshops for organizations on how you connect people to the why and put some measurements around that. And that really drives into objectives and key results, how you drive team-based outcomes, how you move as a team. And if you're doing individual performance reviews, you're probably moving too slow. So how do you review performance at the team level to stay out of that, tactical focus? Risk is a resource, Ed. I'll let you talk about that a little bit. But the one thing I find interesting, again, just because I have kind of declared my own personal war on platitudes and buzzwords and the headlines that drive the HBR articles and everything else, disrupting the disruption, right? How many buzzwords can I fit into one phrase? We talked about transformation, right? And we talked about basically celebrating these champions of disruption. It used to be a young man in his basement, like Ed, that maybe hadn't even moved out of his house yet, could disrupt the whole industry with the right technology. Part of what fed that and made some of these Silicon Valley folks and other kind of poster child disruptors so successful is we had such a clear path of what tomorrow will look like. We don't have that anymore, right? So my personal question is, I'm really curious to see how people are going to be disrupting the disruption, right? How are they going to change their business models? How are they going to have confidence in where they're going to make their plays to really drive some of these shifts and changes that we don't have a clear path forward on? Commercial real estate, what's that going to look like? People often ping us looking for how is Congress going to drive transportation and infrastructure investment. They don't know what the commute and congestion is going to look like. Supply chains are turned upside down. We don't know whether port or rail or what that's going to look like or where it's going to come from 3 years from now, right? We see a decoupling on a macroeconomic level of the US and China and how that ripples, right? So it's very difficult, I think, for people to have that predictability to drive that disruption. So I think that's something that's interesting. Ed, on the risk piece, did you want to touch on that?
The only thing I would say is, working in terms of with students around knowledge and related fields, organization development and innovation, is usually their key question is, how do you demonstrate value to a leader?
Right.
And to me, when I look at this, I think of a team. It could be a space team working a project, or it could be really any kind of a project that's going on. And now you have to bring expertise as how do you build trust? How do you deal with the technologies in terms of remote? There's much more need in terms of being able to work this way at a distance. How do you get breakouts and engagement? That's a whole aspect of it. And to me, one of the things that particularly students don't tend to think about is that knowledge also is a function of risk that the team, the organization is willing to absorb, and how those conversations take place. So we can try a lot of things and take a lot of risks if the organization understands the intent of that and is willing to absorb it, or it changes totally the nature of the team and how we're going to be using the knowledge if it's a risk-averse type of a setting. So each of these, I think, leads to probably dozens of different kinds of specialties that relate to knowledge, expertise, learning, technology, analytics that are embedded in these four frameworks. So one of the things I'd ask you now is to think about yourself. We're living in a day and age of superheroes. The most successful movies that make the most money are the Avengers and Batman and Black Panther and all these kinds of things. And I think it sets up the notion of, if I am a superhero in terms of work and skills and expertise, what is it that is my superhero strength? What is it of what we've been talking about that really makes me great? Is it the ability to work with people? Is it robotics, AI, technology that I'm uber good at? Is it working with organizational society? And so I'd like to just go through is maybe take a minute, and then we will ask for your responses to this. One is, it could be those 7 themes, or it could be anything else you ask. What's your greatest superhero strength in dealing with the current nature of work? And the other part of it is every superhero has a villain, right? Lex Luthor was the villain to Superman. Kryptonite, was the area that would create the biggest problem. What is it of those themes that we've been talking about is it that you'd focus on trying to get support for that is really important for you? So if you can click again, Jordan, just having fun with it. If you're in a superhero comic, what superhero would you be, and what's your great strength from these, and what would be the area that concerns you most? And I'm wondering if there's a way to take it out of slideshow so we can see comments in chat.
Is this everybody kind of, I just want to give everybody a chance to make sure they've kind of taken a catalog of if they're.
So if you can write in the chat, you don't even have to change this, Jordan, but if you can write in chat, what do you think is your area of strength? I was just talking to one of our students who's actually in the Air Force now. And she was talking about, what she was asking me, what job should she go for the future? If she leaves the Air Force, should she stay? And I said, it depends on not only what you love to do, but what are you good at doing? So that's the whole connection to this kind of thing.
You should be able to keep the slide up there and see everybody. If you go to the top of your Zoom window and there's a view options.
Oh, okay. There you go.
And then there's a side-by-side mode. And then this little bar will appear between the people and the slideshow, and you can drag it out and see everybody in the window.
There you go. You're a superhero, Jamie.
I've got Zoom burnout.
So what do you think? For me, that's an easy one. I mean, I would be focusing right on the green, on the it's been about people, working with people, developing people. They nicknamed me a beagle in high school, which I hated because no guy wants to be known as a beagle. But I was told I was friendly, I was affectionate. I had a chief engineer at NASA who said my incredible ability was that I was like a human whisperer. He said you can talk to people and you get them to respond. And it took me a lot of years until I appreciated that whole thing, because to me it always seemed soft. And I wanted to be the engineer. I wanted to be the scientist. My older brother is a scientist, and he knows all math. And he used to, just go crazy about the fact that I just didn't get those concepts. But I think, again, it's a fun way, but to think about is what do we bring? And I think that's one of the things as knowledge people, as innovation people, as change people, as design people, it's how do we leverage the strengths?
We got Matt saying driving autonomy and purpose.
Okay.
We got a few coming in.
Oh, hey, Turo, I didn't see you there.
Yeah, Turo's there. Facing change. Victor.
Yep.
Bringing context into decisions.
The people aspect, people learning. So, I always look at this, you could probably turn it into an assessment, or somebody probably has. But when you're putting together a team, I always tell, I said this to the NASA folks, you don't need to be brilliant in a lot of areas. You just need to have one thing that you can really bring to this mission. And then you have to be good at inviting in and appreciating other people. The biggest challenges, I may even have some NASA people there, but the biggest challenges I had during my career, it was always the same profile. And it was always be told to me, I get a manager says, I have a person who's brilliant. They're smart as all get up. And I would always say, so what's the problem? They can't get along with anybody. And it was really, in some cases, it was heartbreaking, because I saw careers of people who they were so smart, they were so talented in some of the aspects of what they were doing, but they literally couldn't get out of their way. They didn't know how to work. And in those days, I'd always get into a conversation with the manager. I said, so what conversations have you had with that person? And they're telling me, we haven't had any. I said, so you haven't told this person that they they're creating a lot of problem by not being able to work with others. And they say, yeah. I said, why haven't you had that discussion? Well, we don't want them to leave. They're an engineer. And I said, well, what happens if it doesn't turn around, or we're gonna have to get rid of them? Literally, I had one of these conversations, and it was like, but we can look at what are the different skills. And I have a good friend, Charlie Camarda, who's an astronaut in STS-114. He was the director of engineering. And I always said that it's great to have you as a friend, because you know about how to build these spacecraft. I don't know anything about that. And I can work with you on the teams and other things. So it's how it comes together. But I think this has a lot to do with the knowledge profession, is getting students, getting people to not embrace their siloed nature of defending what they do, but how do we pull together teams? How do we design things? How do we leverage? How do we get people having conversations? How do people use stories to get comfortable with success, to be able to address failure? How do we use our technologies and analytics to help things? Right now, I think the big challenge of society is we tend to be very siloed. I don't know your thoughts on that, Jordan, but.
Yeah, no, I mean, it comes into the same thing we talk about. Ed has done a number of things on, what he's referred to as the tale of two shuttles. And when we started working at PMI, and for those of you that have worked with Ed in the past, have probably heard that story of Ed's comparison of the tragedies around Challenger and Columbia. Many years apart, but ultimately when you get down to the root cause analysis of it, some of it with even the same people in the room for both of those in similar roles, how does that happen twice, and what were the differences between those two scenarios from the people standpoint? And that's what led to it. And Ed talked about the academy, the need to be able to develop project skills, really smart people, but how do you put them together into a cohesive project? Great, now we have great individuals. How do we put them into a team? And then how do we develop leaders to incorporate this, across the NASA enterprise? We had a similar situation in the submarine community. My first tour was on a ballistic missile submarine, dual crew, blue and gold crews. Were really clever about this entire dynamic. We'd come together when one crew brought the boat back and make a green crew, because we're really creative and come up with really clever situations like blue and yellow make green. Yeah, amazing. Nuclear engineers, we're smart guys. But we would fix all the things the other crew broke for 30 days. They'd train ashore, we'd take it out. The exact same tool, the exact same platform, the exact same pipes, valves, reactor plant, systems, everything we were touching, turning, working on every day was exactly the same. Our crew won the Battle E as the #1 crew in the entire squadron. The other one was dead last, to the point where I even saw a guy come off and get met on the pier by NCIS literally in shackles. They kept him in shackles in the torpedo room because he physically threatened the captain. That's how eroded the culture was in the environment, right? So it's helping develop people. They had a completely different leadership approach. What's different? The people aspect. How they face change in terms of some of those transition points and manage the transitions on the boat was fatiguing and wearing out the crew. You can go through all these different lists and dynamics, but what's amazing is the exact same tools and equipment, the determining factor was the people and the leadership and how they conducted them, right? And so we found a lot of parallels in that. We've put some thoughts together around that as well too, as we kind of go through helping organizations get through that root cause analysis as to what has made us successful to date. We have a good friend, Barry O'Reilly, that we do a lot of work with, another great resource in his unlearn approach. How do you actually unravel and put out to pasture the things that may have made you successful to date that are no longer relevant going forward, right? That's kind of the next level of competence, right? So you don't always have to repeat the same recipe every time, because you're not going to get the same results. And those are a couple of good resources and a couple of good stories from our own experiences, I think, that have really shaped our thinking on how leaders take stock of these issues and stay objective about them.
Yeah, and so I think you see where we're going with one of the things that I think is really important, that maybe it's emblematic of all of this that John mentioned, is the importance of a systems view. Partly because I was raised at NASA, that the notion was that project management and systems engineering are two sides of the same coin. In other words, you can be good at your discipline of executing and strategizing, but you had to do it within this large framework. And one of the things that I think really effective knowledge people, organization development people, innovation people, design thinking people, I think these are all the same strands, is that when they're good, it's because they're able to pull together the system. Because if you go in different directions of all these, these 8 themes or 7 themes that we're talking about, you can actually take a lot of expertise and it fails. The things that I saw at NASA was that oftentimes the smartest people, when they worked together, their missions had problems because they led with their smarts and not with their ability to collaborate. Yeah, this is work when we were developing the course for Columbia on navigating the future of work, the work of Thomas Koken and his colleagues at MIT. They have a program there. It's nice, it's accessible. I think, what he's saying there is so true. We're living in a world, it's global. It's about technology. It's about new demographics. It's about constant speed. How do we deal with the pace of everything nowadays? And, how do we come together? So this is the reality. Why don't we go to the next slide? We're coming down to the final 8 or 9 minutes. I would just say that one of the activities we did that really resonated with the students is we asked them to put together a social contract representing industry, representing government, representing nonprofit, and representing the worker or labor, take on the different roles and what would that world look like. And it was an interesting activity because while they were doing that, they started assuming their roles. So they started having conflict. You had people when they're in labor positions saying, well, it can't only be for profit. This is what we need. And then you had people on the management side. So it was an interesting facsimile, and they did some nice work there. But I think, the issue is it's about how do we build an economy around working in teams, freelancing, projects, knowledge, innovation. How does that happen? The implications for learning, for dealing with change, for business strategy, for collaborative intelligence, the use of technology and people. I still, every once in a while I get the questions, what's more important, technology or the human? It's a crazy question because you don't make choices, you use both, right? And the notion of high road leadership practices really impressed me. This gets into that organization identity where are you doing things that are making profit and value and you're being successful, but you're also doing something of benefit to the world and society? It's an increasingly important question.
Yep.
Jordan?
Yep. You got it.
And the understanding that the people that we're working with, they expect to be working at places with standards, with good team members, with all of these things. Voice is very important. I was doing a conference last year at PMI that really had an impact on me. I was asked to moderate. It was a panel on the female leader. And when I got the call, I thought, you people, what are you, crazy? I said, I'm not a female leader. Why would you have a guy kind of do that? And then I found out that the 3 women on the panel had known me. And when I spoke to them, I spoke to Laurel Sim, who's a VP portfolio out in Taleo in Calgary. And she said, I don't want this to be just around women. I want men to come in. And if you're moderating it, it'll be kind of people will show up for that reason. But the thing that struck me is we had a whole presentation laid out in slides and all that stuff. And about 5 minutes in, I said, we're open to questions. And before we turned around, we had a line. It oversold. You couldn't get everybody in the room. There were hundreds of people. And the number one thing that I kept hearing is the lack of people being heard in an organization. And I asked a question, I said, of just the women in the room, how many of you have had a significant problem with being heard by these issues? And I thought it'd be like 50%, 90% of the hands went up and almost fell on the floor. And that's when I realized how important really that notion of voice is to all people. It resonated with everyone there. So, it's a different way of working. And we can see the technology, we can see the strategy, we can see the analytics, we can see the call for knowledge, but do we see the need for the conversation and the voice and the engagement and the human aspect? I still think we push that to us, we get there, and that's the wrong. We should start with the people and then follow up.
Yeah, and as the systems guy, and how do you operationalize that? The voice piece is key. We just did a session last night with the Columbia program, like Ed talked about, and had some speakers, providing that, kind of diving into the project aspects of this from a portfolio standpoint. A lot of people were really latching on to the consensus as the enemy of success, right? And it's difficult to do remote now. How does everybody, you want to factor in people's input, you want them to know their voice is heard, but you can't always drive consensus. We'll end up paralyzed and not moving whatsoever. Kind of tying it back to what I talked about, like Patty McCord, Netflix, their strategy and their approach to how they connect people to the why of what they're working on and how it ties together and what they're doing. The more effective leaders are in communicating that and making that understood, and the more effective they are at attaching team objectives that drive that autonomy. So everybody may be paddling, they have some sense of independence, but everybody's paddling generally north, for example, right, on that objective. You can factor in a lot of those voices and collaboration without being succumbing to that paralysis issue. So that's something we work with organizations on, drive workshops on, help them figure out how to utilize various techniques around some of those issues, so that they can drive that operationalized connection to why, how they set product management, lean enterprise driven results through objectives and key results, and still factor in all of that input around the indicators and the assumptions they're looking to validate or disprove with their business models. So we really help them with that. But there is a way to do it if that makes you feel any better. I'm happy to follow up offline with more time if needed. You want to do this last one, Ed?
So I think we go into questions. I realized when I saw John in the group story thinking,
that's fine, yeah.
You know that you have expertise in that. The one thing I say about story is I think that had more to do with changing the culture and improving it at NASA than anything else. That's a pretty big statement. And also I think for leaders and for organizations, they got to spend more time sharing the stories of what's working, why, was doing something with Volvo a couple of years back, and there's a guy who's there for over 30 years. He started tearing up. I said, "Oh, is that emotional?" He said, "No." He says, "I've been working here over 30 years. I love Volvo. It's loved here in Sweden, in Gothenburg." And he said, "But I never heard all the stories of successes and why people love it." I said, "Why haven't we ever done that before?" And then sometimes the best way to approach failure, we don't like to talk about failures. It's very difficult. But a story allows us to see what happened and how we want to deal with it. So I think that those skills are very vital. So why don't we just turn off now and see what questions you have. We're both on LinkedIn, and you can reach us if there are any questions or follow up, but we probably have a couple of minutes for questions. So.
Can we just jump right in?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I love the what was it, 7 or 8 different colors you had of key indicators and themes, and I was almost picturing a spider diagram, sort of a measurement of a balanced scorecard that you could put together, and if you could measure each of those and then put that back in front of an organization on a one page, that would be a pretty cool graphic.
Yeah, no, there wasn't intentionality to it. I was just starting to think, particularly with talking to the students, they always ask the question, what's the future of work? My reaction was, who knows, you get there, right? But then we started researching and studying it. And so that seemed to be a thing. And then I wanted to color code it because I think it stands out. But then I think you're right, John. I think it lends itself to, to some kind of a measurement or approach.
I wrote it down, Ed. John just volunteered. We got it. We're good. It's been recorded.
Aye, Captain.
Yeah, no, this is really good, Ed, and if I could just sort of pile on this, I mean, and it's not meant to sell my book, but it's so important to understand that the second industrial revolution, we started looking at input, process, output of car factories, and then we walked away with that, and it became our mental model, and we still have it stuck in our head that's the questions we ask, and that's the process we're looking for, and we need to move off of that mental model of work and move to story as the mental model work, not just for how to talk, but how we work. And it's so true. And I just see that as the future of work. It comes back to the structure of story, people having that structure and knowing how to work together around that being the game plan.
Yeah. And many of the leading firms, you know, I was talking to someone from Amazon who's saying, yeah, they're taught when they talk to a customer is to get the story, because that gives them the sense of what to work on. And of course, design thinking is heavily influenced by story. So I think it's a major capability that, you know, it's become much more popular now. I still don't think it gets the right amount of emphasis.
Yeah, agreed.
All right, well, we're right at 5.
Yep.
I'm always happy to keep talking to you guys, but it is 5, so
Appreciate your time.
thank you guys so much for doing this, despite being on the road and all, and having
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Thank
Thank
you.
you very much. I enjoyed it.
Wonderful.
Great to see you again.
Great
Yeah.
presentation.
Wonderful.
Yeah, great. Thank you guys. Thanks for attending, everybody, and we'll see you
Thank you.
next month.
All right.
Thanks, everybody.
Yay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take
Bye.
care.
See you, Tara.
Thank you for watching KMCDC's presentation. Hope to see you at the next monthly meeting.